Welcome to King County Connects, a program where we connect you with the important issues in our region. I'm Enrique Cerna. Stories of mass shootings and high-profile suicides. Is there a way to curb gun violence and save lives? Well, here in Washington State, a new law is helping police seize guns from people in crisis. It's called the Extreme Risk Protection Order, or ERPO. And we're talking today with King County Deputy Prosecutor Kim WYATT and Seattle Police Sergeant DOROTHY Kim. Both are part of a unit that enforces the protection orders. And welcome to both of you. Well, let me start with you, Kim WYATT, and a little bit of history here. This was really passed in 2016 by the people of the state through initiative, but it took a while before it was actually implemented and first here in King County. Give me a little bit of background on that.
Sure. So the Extreme Risk Protection Order Act was modeled based on California's Gun Violence Restraining Order, and that law in California was done after a mass shooting in the Santa Barbara area where a family member who was in crisis, the parents, and I believe the school counselor possibly saw some warning signs for that individual and went to law enforcement and were asking for help. And at that time in California, there was nothing for law enforcement to do. So after that horrific shooting in Santa Barbara, California passed their law. Our law was modeled in part on that, as you said, by Citizens Initiative in 2016. In, I would say, late to mid 2017 is when we started to see some of the extreme risk protection orders coming in, and especially since our unit has formed officially as of January 1st, we are seeing extreme risk protection orders come in. I would say one law enforcement, one at least probably one a week or so in our unit.
And then, but it took a while to get the funding, right, for your unit to be created, as I understand it.
Correct. There were work groups that were led by retired Judge Ann Levinson, both on the extreme risk protection order and then also for the order to surrender weapons as part of House Bill 1840. When somebody has a protective order that qualifies, and the court has also issued an order to surrender weapons. There was nobody to enforce, no law enforcement officials assigned, no prosecutors assigned to enforce those orders to make sure that the respondents in those orders that have firearms are being held accountable. And so with Judge Levinson's work and work groups, I believe for 18 months or more, it took a long time of bringing all different people together, from judges to lawyers to community members and advocates, King County, the City of Seattle, Seattle Police Department, and numerous law enforcement agencies throughout King County.
Well, tell me about the work that you do, because you're working with the prosecutor's office and to, I guess, follow through on the orders and also look for any weapons.
Yes. So I supervise the 4 detectives that serve all the domestic violence protection orders in the City of Seattle, including the ones that have the order to surrender weapons. On the order to surrender weapons, we consult with the regional group to get more information, because the prosecutor's office also has advocates that are also reaching out to the victims or the petitioners to get more information about where the firearms are or what knowledge they have of the firearms. We then follow up with them, and we will go out and serve the orders. And on the order to surrender weapons by department policy, I actually do a risk assessment on each one. And then I determine, based on the risk assessment, if I need to screen it with SWAT. And so oftentimes our SWAT officers actually will go out with us just to serve the paperwork. And then at that point, we try to before we go in there, we try to figure out if there are any firearms and if they're likely to be there, and use that knowledge to gain voluntary compliance from the person being served the protection order with an order to surrender. And for the most part, if there's no other criminal allegations, we work really hard at just explaining to them that right now it's just a civil court order, but if they don't comply with the order, that we are now the mechanism in place that will start a criminal case of, at the very least, a failure to comply case. And
basically say to let them know that they need to give up the weapon.
And that somebody's watching them, and that we're going to make sure that the order is enforced. And and we try to make it at this point as easy as possible. We can take their firearms, we'll put them in evidence, we'll take care of them and help them with the paperwork. But we explain that if they don't follow through with the court order and comply with it, then there's a possibility that we could be back with a search warrant or other things that we try to do to make sure that there's compliance.
Are these mainly domestic violence situations?
I would say it's both. I mean, I would say the majority are domestic violence, but as I noted earlier, we are getting an increased number of extreme risk protection orders coming in. So our unit is handling both of those. So we're staffing those cases each week.
Take me through going out in the field and doing this, because this does not sound like it could be dangerous work.
Mm-hmm. And that's part of the reason why for every order to surrender weapons, I actually do a risk assessment. A lot of them I will have to screen with SWAT based on some of the criteria that I see as I do a criminal history check, their contacts with police in the past, if there are any criminal history, if there's any current cases, and I go through all of that, and also...
And if they had any contact with a weapon.
Yeah. And, and I check to see if they have a concealed license permit and if they have any firearms on their purchase history. After I do the risk assessment and we don't get any big red flags, we'll just work with the respondent to arrange a time to come to the precinct or come to headquarters with the guns unloaded, keep them in their car. Then we'll, and then they come in and talk to us first, and then we get the keys, and we do it as safely as we can. Oftentimes, with an order to surrender weapons, there's a DV protection order, so the respondent actually can't go back to the house where the firearms are, and based on the order. And so then we will make arrangements with the petitioner and also with the respondent. The respondent telling us where the gun safe is or where the guns are in the house, and then the officers, the detectives, will go to the petitioner and get the firearms. And obviously that's much more safe for us, because the respondent is separated from the firearms, and then we're getting them when the respondent isn't supposed to be there. So oftentimes we'll actually go out and get on a criminal case when there's an order to surrender and the suspect is in jail, then we'll make contact with the victim if it's a shared residence, and we'll go out and get him the firearms when the suspect is in jail, because obviously that's safest for us as well. So we work really hard at making it as safe as possible for us, recognizing that also it makes it safer for both the victim, the suspect, petitioner, and respondent to have the firearms out of the home.
What kind of firearms have you found?
We have found everything. It's actually really amazing. Like this last Friday, we actually had some firearms surrendered to us, and it included everything from handgun that when the detective told me was 500 caliber, which I didn't even know that gun existed.
That's big,
right?
Big. I've shot one of those.
Yeah.
It knocked me down.
So he had that and AR-15 and like a modified. It's not a Uzi, but something like that. Just this vast array of firearms. And he was cooperative, but he wasn't allowed to come back to the house. So the petitioner then gathered up the firearms for us to retrieve them and put them into evidence while there's this ongoing court case.
Mm-hmm. So as you go through this process, I mean, obviously in some cases we're talking domestic violence, but we also have issues with their mental health issues as well. Is the process the same?
It's a little bit different. ERPOs are generally, anyone can apply for an ERPO, like a family member that they can go and petition the court for that. Recently, it's been majority law enforcement that's been doing it, especially our crisis response team. They will identify somebody that is in crisis and trying to figure out what to do with them, and maybe have contact with the family members who say that this person has a gun. So the Seattle police officer will actually go through with the petition and actually go to court and get an ERPO, an extreme risk protection order. And Kim and her unit also help assist with that, walking the officers through the process, because it is a little bit of a process for the ERPO, especially if it's law enforcement going and getting it.
Right.
So,
how many guns have you taken in?
Well, the whole unit, including King County and Seattle Police Department, from January 1 to April 30th, 181 firearms.
Whoa,
and
that's
then,
a lot of guns.
Yeah, and then my particular unit in the last month or two have gotten another 20 or so.
What happens to the guns after you take them in?
We put them into evidence, and Seattle Police Department has an evidence unit, a section of the evidence unit that's specifically filled with the firearms.
Okay.
So they're stored in a secure location.
There the chance down the road that the individuals will get the weapons back?
Of course, yeah. Especially for the civil court orders. Once the court order is completed or the terms have expired, then they can request a judge to then do an order to release the firearms. And then we do our normal background check and make sure that there's no other prohibiting factors, and they will get their firearms back. If there's a DV criminal case and there's a conviction, then they won't get their firearms back unless they petition the court for
to get their rights restored.
rights to restored.
Or,
Yeah.
in a domestic violence situation. Saving lives?
Absolutely.
Yeah. What I like to say actually is that someone that is committed to killing their intimate partner, we're probably not going to stop them. But what we are going to stop is when in the middle of the night and you're arguing and you're drunk and you're drinking and you're upset and you have access to a firearm, that's where we're going to see the prevention of loss of life. Yeah. And I was just talking to Kim before the show that the firearms that the detectives got on Friday, they were all scattered throughout the whole house. They weren't secure. They were loaded, and there's a 2-year-old kid toddling about. You know, at the very least, I feel like, hopefully, we've saved that kid's life from accidentally finding it and then shooting themselves or someone else.
Right. This program and the law, really, I think one of the things is that not enough people know about it. Is that one of your challenges in getting the word out about it?
Definitely, and especially for the extreme risk protection order, for family members that are concerned about a loved one that want to come in and prevent, future gun violence. I mean, that's really what the ERPA was designed for, right? Doesn't have restraint provisions to prevent the parents or the intimate partner from each other. It's really about taking the guns away for a temporary period of time in order for that crisis to resolve itself. So it's either threats of harm to self or others, or somebody that's exhibiting violent behavior, or sort of the standards for when we're looking at an extreme risk protection order. A lot of the ones that we have seen have been a mental health type crisis.
Which we've seen situations now too where then lead to a mass shooting, either in a school or in a church or elsewhere. So this is really aimed at trying to prevent that from ever getting that far, right?
It is, and we have an advocate that's available to assist family members that if they're, concerned or they're not sure about the process. We also have our information on our website, which is protectionorder.org, which lists all the protective orders that you can get in King County, including the extreme risk protection order. And so it lays out some more information if family members are interested. It also applies to roommates if they've resided together in the past year, so they could also be potentially a petitioner. But if family members have concerns, we would really encourage them to reach out to crisis intervention folks, to contact your local law enforcement agency, or to reach out to us.
Are other law enforcement agencies in the state of Washington as active and doing the type of work that you're doing? Or is King County and Seattle out in front in this?
I can't speak to what's happening in other parts of the state. I do know that our unit is getting calls from Pierce County, from Snohomish County. We are working with our federal partners on different cases, from the ATF to the FBI. So as cases are coming in, and as we know, firearms aren't always going to stay in one jurisdiction, and petitioners may have fled for the violence, or the family members may be in one jurisdiction and the respondent or defendant is in another. So we've really had to reach out and try to build some connections with law enforcement, with military connections as well, just to be sharing information, because it's so critical that we tackle it together. So I don't know if that answers your question, but we've had law enforcement from the State Patrol, from Kirkland, Bothell, Bellevue, certainly Seattle, the Sheriff's Department, Federal Way, Des Moines are the ones that come to my mind off the top of my head.
Yeah.
Well, all the jurisdictions are struggling with how to comply with House Bill 1840, and about following up with these order to surrenders. And it is hard because it's the order to surrender with the DVPO starts in a civil court. So there's no law enforcement representation and there's no prosecutor. So really what this unit is doing is helping to bridge that gap where we would get maybe law enforcement would get information that they weren't complying with an order and there were guns and the victim was contacting law enforcement. And traditionally law enforcement would be like, well, I don't know, it's kind of a civil issue. Do we do anything with it? And really this unit now is kind of bridging that gap and having the victim or the petitioner have somewhere to go to really address their concerns if there are still firearms out there. And now we have a mechanism in place to investigate it and try to get them out.
And the two offices are working together because then you can get the legal information to know
And
what you're doing.
also the advocates that work within the group, they do a great job of contacting the victim and getting lots of very relevant information for us, even as far as having them circle what type of firearms they've seen, because that gives us as law enforcement more information about the firearms that we could expect to see.
Tell me more about the advocates.
Well, we have wonderful advocates. We have a specific firearms advocate, and then we have a court coordinator as well who does a lot of our firearms interviews. And I would say that they are both seeking additional information from victims about, as Sergeant Kim said, where the firearms are located, or some other important questions that they're asking, which I think is helpful for law enforcement and also for us as prosecutors, is, how important are these firearms to this individual, right? Is this somebody who got, grandpa's firearms passed down to them and it's sentimental, or is this somebody who is, very connected to their firearms in the sense that, and I don't know if that speaks to you about if you see that, if somebody, I think the question is like on a 1 to 5, how important are the firearms? So when we see, and most of them that we see often are 4 or 5s, but when you see a 5 plus, not friendly to law enforcement, those are all lethality factors that Sergeant Kim has to address, and we address as well when we're looking at a case to see, is there some criminal aspect that we could charge? What's the best path here in ensuring the public safety and, of course, the safety of the victim and getting the firearms?
And how you're going to approach this, I take it, when you're going to go out in the
That's
field.
all very important information for us.
Yeah.
So.
How about, I know that some gun rights advocates had some concerns about all of this, saying that, well, just another way for people to get their guns taken away from them. How do you kind of walk that fine line, I suppose, to make sure that that's not the case?
Well, these are temporary orders, right? And I would say that these are all being done by a judicial officer is making a finding on all of these orders. So with the orders to surrender weapons from a domestic violence case, a stalking case, anti-harassment order, and certainly the extreme risk protection orders, they are all coming before a judge on multiple phases to make a finding. So it's not just the prosecutor's office or law enforcement saying it. A judicial officer is also reading to see if there's reasonable cause to issue that particular emergency order or a preponderance of the evidence, meaning has these certain factors been met for a full order to be issued. So I would say there's thought involved in that, and so it's not just somebody calling up and then the order is automatically issued, right? They have to go before a judge, and then
It's a process.
It's a process.
It's a due process too.
Right.
Which is probably the key here. There is a due process.
And they have, the respondent has the opportunity to show up in court 14 days after the initial temporary order is issued. And the respondent can explain to the judge why they need their firearms or why they shouldn't be taken or whatever, and then a judge can make that determination if we're going to hold on to them for the length of the whole protection order or make an exception and return the firearms. But there's, at every stage, a place for the respondent to address the court and, have a due process about the firearms.
This kind of work, I would imagine at times it can be stressful because you're going out and maybe not knowing what the situation is, but then I suppose it could also be quite gratifying.
Yeah. I actually think it's really gratifying. I've been a police officer for 24 years, and I would say this is the most proactive thing I've ever done as far as really trying to prevent harm, before there is harm, essentially. And I really like that, and I really think it also protects the suspect and the prohibited person, because it's such an emotional time, especially if they're going through a separation, that if there's any substance abuse or mental health issues, that their access to the firearms could actually, they'll use it for suicide, and that occurs quite a bit. And I think it's just important for the safety of the whole family, for all the people involved, law enforcement, the children, and even the respondent, to have those firearms out of the house during this moment of crisis.
Right. And we're looking at a wide range of issues here in many ways, because or could be a domestic violence type of situation, a relationship issue. It could be a mental health issue, and not only just the sense that it could be someone that might want to go out and shoot something up, but also could harm themselves. So,
Exactly.
and this is what everything that you have to kind of examine, right?
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. This process, and again, do you think you've been able to, save lives, but also maybe stop some things that could have really become bad out in the community?
I think so. A lot of the people that we have come into contact, of course, are legitimate, law-abiding citizens who are just going through a rough patch in a relationship. But other people that we've actually gone out to get their firearms as a result of the court order were kids in the schools that had made some threats to other students.
Wow.
And then they had guns. They had access to guns based on their parents, because their parents had firearms. And we were able to, my unit was able to work with the parents, even though technically they weren't required to turn in the firearms, but we were able to work with the parents to get the firearms turned in just, while this crisis is going on. Because no one wants a school shooting, right? But in the past, before the ERPO, before this unit, there would be no mechanism in place to even talk to the parents really to get them to turn in the firearms and just make sure that everyone stays safe. So we've had 2 or 3 where there were threats at local high schools. So.
And again, this comes back to people knowing about this extreme risk protection order, the ERPO, and knowing that there is there's a way to report this or find out that you might be able to do something.
Right, because family members are often in the best position, right, to see the warning signs, and you hear it often described as red flag behavior. And when we hear that as domestic violence prosecutors and law enforcement that work in this field, they're very similar high risk factors. If somebody has suicidal ideation, a substance abuse issue, if there's any domestic violence behavior, any prior assaults, stalking behavior, all those types of things are behaviors that we are looking at as prosecutors and law enforcement in analyzing domestic violence cases. And those are often present in extreme risk protection orders as well.
Yeah. And I think, especially with the extreme risk protection orders, if a family member is noticing that one of their family, I always use the example of like a mother who has an adult son who may be decompensating or, becoming more mentally ill or in crisis. They don't want to prevent contact, but the mom wants to make sure that her son doesn't have access to firearms where he could hurt himself or anyone else. And if that son basically doesn't have any criminal history, they wouldn't be prohibited from obtaining a firearm or having a firearm without this extreme risk protection order. And that's where I think it's really important, especially for people with limited criminal history, which wouldn't prevent them from having a firearm, that getting an extreme risk protection order, especially a family member that's involved with it, is the best way to keep everyone safe.
And the order also, so the goal of the order is to prevent somebody's access to firearms. So that includes both their current possession and also their ability to purchase. So that's why it's so critical. And the court, the way the statute is written, once a judge has made a judicial finding on an extreme risk protection order, it has to be entered immediately into the system. So it was designed that way to be, and same for law enforcement, so that this individual cannot go out and purchase firearms. And it also prevents the individual respondent from being able to hold a valid concealed pistol license, which is important because if you hold a concealed pistol license, you can bypass some of the background checks. And that was our concern on some of these extreme risk protection orders, why they have to be very timely and you have to move pretty quickly when you start seeing some of these behaviors.
Yeah. So you're looking to really avert anything that could turn out into a deadly situation more than anything else, and that's what this is the most important thing about it.
Right.
Yeah, yeah. So what final word, what would you tell the public?
If you are a family member or a close friend of somebody and you see behaviors that have changed, you see a fixation with firearms coupled with maybe some suicidal ideation, there's a change in behavior, there's a concern, then to say something, to speak up. And if it's not coming directly to law enforcement, it's to seek professional help from a crisis line or somebody else. But don't just ignore the behavior. And that's what the civil order has done, because it's better to intervene on the civil side than if something horrific was to happen and then we're dealing with it on the criminal side. So for family members to speak up and to advocate also for their loved one, but to know that the order is really done as a temporary measure to prevent access to guns.
And that's what I think is important about the extreme risk protection order too. Even as a patrol officer going out to certain, domestic disturbances that involve a mentally ill family member, that in the past law enforcement would say, well, they haven't committed a crime, they haven't done anything, so there's nothing I can do. But now we have this information that we can give them, or even start our own petition to do an extreme risk protection order, because we know we can look at the situation and see that something could be occurring, and now we just have another tool to either provide the family or even ourselves to help prevent any future violence.
Right. I appreciate your work. I'm glad actually that we have this order and that it is being enforced here in King County, and appreciate your work too. Stay safe.
All right,
That's the biggest thing. You too.
Thank you.
Right.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
And thanks for joining us for King County Connects. You can visit us online at kingcounty.gov/KCTV. I'm Enrique Cerna, and we'll see you next time.